My next guest is Evan Whitehead. Evan has been an educator for more than 20 years, spanning 3 decades. Over the course of his career, he has held the following positions: special education paraprofessional, special education high school teacher, Latino parent outreach coordinator, dean of student discipline, community outreach coordinator, director of special services, director of bilingual education and English learners, Title I director, and assistant superintendent of special services. Currently, Evan is the director of special services for a PK-8 school district in Illinois. In his current role, Evan oversees all federal programs, early childhood education, multi-tiered systems of support, social emotional learning, equity, diversity, and cultural competency. Evan is also a national consultant, trainer, presenter, speaker, frequent podcast contributor, mental health advocate, mindfulness practitioner, and proponent of equity, diversity, and intercultural competency. Evan's 3 Bs, balance, boundaries, and breaks, promote self-advocacy in the areas of mental health, self-care, and well-being. Thanks for being on the podcast, Evan.
Thanks, and I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. I know we were looking to coordinate, but I'm glad we got a chance to connect this afternoon.
Well, I read this list of just those different roles that you've held mostly in the area of special education and working with students in their social emotional learning, focusing on, helping kids thrive through adversity, right? A lot of these kids that you're working with are in Title I schools, and they're lacking equity, those opportunities that we're thinking so much about now as we begin the 2021 school year. So we discussed a little bit in the pre-chat about a time you were in the trenches and how you managed to crawl out, and you wanted to discuss a little bit about your ongoing work with those students.
Sure. Well, I think when you talk about, being in the trenches, I think a lot of us identify with that in different ways, and kind of climbing out of that. For me personally and professionally, it's something that, I dealt with and have obviously overcome. And I think it's just part of some self-work and life work. I think that as individuals, we all have our own story, and, it takes us on different paths. But at the end of the day, it's really about, where we are now or where we're looking to go, and how do we do that? So, for me, I think that, throughout my professional career, I've always kind of been on the front lines, supporting and advocating for, students that have had less opportunities or challenges, and families as well that have had challenges. And I think it's just something that resonated with me because, a lot of times I was able to see myself in those children and see myself, within those families as well. So a lot of things always connected with me, and I wanted to be able to find a way to make connections with them and to help and support them to navigate our school system. And so I think that, along the way, that type of work is heart work as well. And, for those of us that are in special education or working with Title I schools or working in communities that, are from a lower socioeconomic status, we pour a lot into that work. We put our heart, we put our soul into it, and a lot of times we feel as though, we get a lot of, from that comes a lot of additional stress and angst, because we're always trying to do so much for them, and we put so much into it. It's tiring, and sometimes we ignore kind of our own needs by putting those families and those students ahead of ours, because we feel a sense of obligation to do so. So I think me, like many others educators I've spoken with, have found themselves in a situation where they've forgotten about taking care of themselves, and had to kind of go back and refocus and center themselves so they could be, become the type of educator and type of person that they want to be in life.
Yeah. So that's especially important right now as we begin the 2021 school year. And, I know from working as a school administrator, working so closely with the special ed department and having those meetings, it's not only the IEP meetings, right? There's a lot of things that come up that we have to monitor for certain kids. And there's kids that, have different challenges behaviorally and academically, social, emotionally. And A lot of those meetings are ones that, you know, they aren't planned, right?
Right.
You hear about it that day or maybe the day
Right.
before if you're lucky. So, you know, and as you say, I really resonate with that. You know, you're really thinking about what we can do for our children, especially those children who are, you know, needing the extra support. And we take those stories with us home, right? we
We
think
do.
about, like, you know, how can we better help this family? How can we support them? And, you know, I really, admire the work that you've done in your district, because I've been there myself, not in the role of a special ed department chair or anything, but just as an administrator and seeing, you know, those kids in the Title I setting. So
Yeah.
talk to me a little bit about the keynotes that you do and the training that you do for schools for Ruby Payne.
Sure.
Talking a little bit about your 3Bs.
Sure, sure. So I've been a national consultant and presenter for the AHA Process, Ruby Payne's company, for a couple of years now. And, you know, the work that she does is phenomenal. Obviously, she has, you know, her best-selling book, Framework for Understanding Poverty, that's, I believe now is almost 30 years old, but yet the information is still relevant. And you know, the thing about the work of Ruby is that, you know, it takes away some of the other layers in terms of having those conversations about what students need and families need. It takes away layers such as race, ethnicity, and looking at some of the true factors in terms of socioeconomics that often compound factors and challenges that families have. So on top of that, you know, with that being the flagship book, about 2 years ago, she put out her book, which is Emotional Poverty in All Demographics: How to Reduce Anger, Anxiety, and, you know, angst and depression in the classroom. And the thing about that book, what resonated with me, you know, this was that, you know, now we're really talking about the true social emotional concepts,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that impact students and families. And once again, you know, transcending, you know, race, ethnicity, and, you know, really talking about the fact that regardless of, you know, socioeconomics or status, you know, students go through a lot, right? They have a lot of challenges in their lives. You know, we think about, you know, affluent families. We often don't think about the types of pressure that those students are under sometimes in their homes, the pressure to succeed, to overachieve at a high level, starting at a very young age. And, you know, that's a lot of pressure to put on a child, you know, of always having to be great or better than, and the expectations of others. It's a lot. And then also the fact that, you know, oftentimes, you know, there's a lot of families and young people that grow up in households that they may have a lot of wealth and they may have a lot of material objects, but sometimes there's a disconnect and the families are not there and not present for them sometimes. So there's a lot missing. And then obviously we know that there are other, you know, risk factors that are involved with students from, you know, so lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and also students from different cultures that they're dealing with daily. And I think that's kind of what we see now and what has been highlighted because of the current pandemic, right? So a lot of the challenges that many of us knew existed, they were now magnified, right? So simple things such as, you know, we talk about access and opportunity, you know, when we could no longer be in person and face to face, and we, you know, and we in the field all thought about remote learning, we realized that there's an equity issue with having, you know, devices and having internet access and the strength and the bandwidth to do things remote learning and things we just never thought about that we had to now be cognizant of. And, you know, the other piece, especially now that I think a lot of conversations are about, is that for those families that are even their children are in a hybrid model where they're, you know, working, they're at home studying, and then they come in for, you know, a couple days of the week, is childcare. Right? Something as simple as childcare, you know, was often overlooked. And now there are people that are really having to make a decision about, like, you know, how do I make sure my child's taken care of and still making sure that I have a job? You know, everyone doesn't have the luxury where they can stay home and they don't need to worry about, you know, finances. And that's something that's big right now, of how do you do that? How do you balance that? So the emotional poverty talks about really, you know, how those factors impact a student's life and when they impact a student life, and also some of the physiological responses that come about that and how they're manifested. And really, that even though it's not necessarily a medical condition, however, a lot of those risk factors do have an impact on physical ailment. It's rooted in a lot of work of, obviously, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma informed practices, and understanding that, all of the things that we go through, good or bad, have an impact on who we are as a person. Mm-hmm. And, when you're a child, and the younger that you experience some of those traumatic events, they have a greater impact on you because you're still developing, your brain's still developing. And then a lot of times, your responses are more so reactions because your brain is not developed and you have not developed a way to cope with some of those things. So in the training, we cover a lot. And then in the second half of the training in the book, really starts to focus on not only students, but adults and educators. And the reality is that, even though many of us have achieved a lot in life, and we look successful from the outside, and we went through school, where now we're educators, we still have a lot of things that we haven't dealt with that have happened in our lives, or that are currently happening in our lives, that impact the work that we do and impact how we interact with students and our colleagues as well, and how we need to recognize that and how we can begin to work on that as well. Because there's a concept through the training in the book that is called the emotional dance in the classroom. And that's basically a power struggle, right? So when you have a child that has an unregulated brain, and you have an adult whose brain is unregulated, potentially due to stress, trauma, et cetera, in their lives, what happens is you have two brains that get to a point where they explode, right? And then you have this power struggle. Typically, you would expect someone that's an adult that their chronological age will align with their emotional age. Mm-hmm. But what happens is when things such as trauma and stress and, other risk factors from childhood, your maturity in terms of your emotional maturity actually stops. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is every time there's a stressful event, or you feel that you're under attack and for your safety, you respond the way in which you would have responded at that age in which that last event happens. So you see that happening a lot, in classrooms with teachers. You see it happen, with colleagues. You also see it, in personal relationships as well. So I think that's just an aspect to bring that awareness. So, when I talk about that, those are things I talk about. More recently, there is now Emotional Poverty 2, which just came out a couple months ago. And that focuses a lot more on the adults. And I think it's timely because everything that's happened now with COVID and the social justice issues that we see now in the country, there's a lot that adults are trying to manage and trying to juggle and trying to determine, how do we find that balancing act? Like, how do we do all these things? Because before we could compartmentalize it, right? So we go to work, 8 o'clock, get off 3, 4 o'clock, right? And that was our work life, right? We had our work life, it was separated. Then, we come home and we had a little transition time if we had a commute from work or what have you. We get home and then we could transition into like our family life and whatever activities are involved with that. Ever since the pandemic happened, right, everything has been simultaneous. So now if you are a parent or a caregiver, you're doing that. You're also have your job. And if you're an educator as well, you have your students that you are teaching. And then on top of that, you still may have your own relationship if you're a spouse or significant other, or if you're a caregiver of an elderly family member or a parent. Mm-hmm. All those things have come to a head, and we're expecting people to just do them all at once as if it's easy, and it's tough. So I think as we, a little bit about the Emotional Poverty 2 really focuses on what do we need to do to get ourselves centered, and how do we work through this? Because now this is all new angst, stress, and things that we haven't experienced before, but what the same expectations are in place as if it were pre-COVID. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, you discussed a lot in this answer right now, and I just wanted to unpack some of the areas you discussed.
Sure.
One of those areas, I find especially interesting is that, the work-life balance and how, in the US, at least recently, we've had a lot of these, and a lot of it's been, at least in my area in Colorado, we do have childcare available, but once a kid is in kindergarten, a lot of the school districts are who are remote, at least for the beginning of the school year. They don't have that option for parents to have the child go anywhere during the day. So, you could be in a family with 5 kids in different grades, and there is a parent who has to stay at home. And, spouses might juggle, their shifts and figure out a way where somebody works the evening or night shift. But I think just in general, as a society in the US, way before the pandemic, the childcare issue is a huge issue. The fact that, I have 3 kids myself, and I know for a fact that, infant childcare is more than a year in college, and, it keeps going up. And personally, we decided to pay the place where he was doing pre-K for kindergarten, to do private kindergarten.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't going to be in the district hybrid setting, because what was I going to do with him at home 3 days a week? Right. So, but not everybody can pay that. So, that's why there's, just such inequity right now with the situation, and, how parents are supposed to juggle both work and home. And I think, as you said, that really ties into this work-life balance, and how I think you said, just in your observations, how maybe the needs for staff self-care have evolved in the past 10 years. You mentioned a little bit in the pre-chat about, there used to be that need for happy hour, every month or something, right? But now it's kind of, we have a lot more, and I've spoken with other guests on the podcast about this as well. There's a lot more educators who are getting burned out. There are a lot more educators who are turning to alcohol and drugs. And, what do you think we can do just as we're, starting a new school year? And we had a lot of educators that did leave the profession or decided to take a sabbatical, but how can we avoid, going basically to the dark side with addictions, and, or maybe anything else that could be a type of addiction, like gambling, or even, online shopping, right? Just ways of, negative outlets for stress.
Well, I think the reality of a lot of that is escapism, right? And it's a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. And, with coping mechanisms, I like to look at it. It's not necessarily if they're good or bad. It's whether or not they're sustainable, mm-hmm. right? Because they do work, mm-hmm. right? At that, during that moment, that instant, or for some period of time, yeah. But eventually they no longer work anymore. And, so I think it's important for us to recognize, within our profession, a lot of those challenges exist. And I think for a long time, in our field of education, we didn't openly talk about the need for wellness and self-care. Right. It was almost as if, it was a badge of honor for the educator to openly discuss how much they worked and how long they stayed in the office, or what they did on the weekends in terms of grading papers. And then, during the summers, talked about, the classes they took. And, I think a lot of that, from my perspective, has been because we were really trying to downplay the hurt, mm-hmm. and the challenge that we're having. So we tried to mask it, right? So we put on this face as if everything was okay, but it really wasn't. So we tried to justify, why we were doing it. And I think that, I don't know, if it's because, as you said, there's been a lot of educator burnout and turnover, recently, and probably also what is going on now. I think it's opened up a lot of, eyes to that. Personally, for me, is one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate for mental health and educator self-care and wellness, because, I was one of those people, right? I went through my own challenges, and made it out, however, my story that I have, is not different than a lot of people, right? Externally, we're doing everything that appears to be okay, and we're going okay, but we're taking so much on, and we're not speaking to it or speaking about it, you know, we get to a place where we try to find other ways to cope and just push through. And, you know, that's a lot of where my 3Bs came into play for me, and you know, they truly helped me to get through a lot and really save my life. And you know, the 3Bs for me are my balance, boundaries, and breaks. And you know, as I was healing through a lot, you know, those 3 words kept resonating. They became themes. You know, and the first B was just balance, you know, the work-life balance, you know, and just energy and time and effort balance. You know, I realized through my own personal and professional life, you know, I was trying to do a lot, you know, just to, you know, make sure I had all my bases covered, or I would try to do more because I thought it would help me to advance in my career. You know, I took a lot on, you know, but not realizing the importance of how do you balance that, because, you know, you still have those other life responsibilities. So, you know, with the balance, it's more about like, how are you balancing what works for you? Because we're never going to have an ideal balance, right? We're never going to have 50% work life, 50% family life. It's not going to work. But in the moment, how do you find ways to shift and recognize when you have to change the balance of the energy and time that you're doing? So for me, with the balance, you know, it's more about being mindful and being aware of the time, energy, and efforts, and what you put that time, energy, and effort into, whether it's projects, people, relationships, and understanding that. You know, and then, you know, the next one is balance, is boundaries. And the boundaries is not so much about the boundaries of others, which is obviously you know, important, and it's part of social awareness, but it's our own personal boundaries, right? You know, as educators, we're givers, right? We're givers by nature. We're fixers. You know, we want to help, you know, and oftentimes we put so much into everybody else and other things, and we don't say no, right? We feel as though it's going to be, you know, saying no is a bad thing, or we're going to look like the bad person, or someone's going to be upset with us. So like, you know, for me personally, I would take on a lot and try to help, whether that was professionally or personal life with family members, you know, and, you know, I wanted to be that person that was there, but I wasn't getting that in return from everybody all the time. So I had to realize that, you know, you have to have your boundaries and stick to them and adhere to them, because at the end of the day, you know, the only person that's going to be the best advocate for you is yourself. No one's going to, you know, they may say, oh, are you doing okay, and check in on you. But like, unless you kind of stick to your boundaries and stand, you know, stand in ground play, draw the line in the sand and say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. You know, it gets to the point where, you know, you talked about things. How do teachers start feeling burnout? How do educators get burnout? And how do they get to a point? Well, because they're not saying no. You know, they're not doing it in a way in which, you know, that's healthy for them, and it gets out of hand before they can reel it in. And the last one is breaks. You know, that to me was probably the biggest aha moment for me in terms of a lot of my healing and becoming better as an educator and as a person, was that, you know, I felt that I was always needed to play catch up. You know, like I was a non-traditional undergrad student, meaning like there was a gap in between the time I graduated high school and then eventually got my bachelor's degree. So I felt that I was behind my peers. So I expedited a lot of things and took on a lot to try to get to that point and play catch up, which obviously we all know, like, it, you know, there's no need to do that. But like, that was kind of ingrained with me. You know, I was an athlete my whole life. So it was always the idea of a challenge and trying to push through and keep going. And I did a lot early in my career. You know, by the time I was 34, I was an assistant superintendent, you know, so I took on a lot once again, but I never really took the chance to pause in life. I never got a chance to smell the roses, so to speak. It was always, what's the next thing? Yeah. And, you know, it took a toll on me, because eventually, like, I was forced to pause, right? Like it was an involuntary pause because your mind, your body, your spirit can only take on so much. So it means you have to slow down. So, that's where, my three B's and my, come into play. And they're rooted in mindfulness and rooted in dialectical behavioral therapy and understanding and just being aware, aware. And, I'm a mindfulness practitioner. So I meditate and I do other things, to keep me grounded and balanced. And I think, for educators, I think we just need to give ourselves grace and start small, right? We can't like turn things around overnight. The pandemic, gave a lot of us some of the things we've always asked for, right? We always wanted more time to spend with our families. We wanted more time to, kind of take on a new hobby or read that book that we wanted to do. We wanted to do some of those other things. And then when we got it, we didn't really know what to do with it, right? It was, we were pushing back like, oh no, like I can't do what right? But really it was all the things that we all wanted in our lives. We always wanted extra time, more hours in the day. So during the pandemic, especially when it started early on, some people were just surviving, others were thriving during that time, so, I think that's, for educators, just taking the time and starting out slow, you can pause and take time out in your day, even though it's 10 minutes, just to do that. Also communicate and talk with people. Don't keep a lot of things inside because, just as you may be that teacher in your classroom that's, working late hours, or now if you're in a remote setting, you're putting your schedule together and you're working on the weekends to put that together. You know what? There's probably 10 other teachers that are doing the same exact thing, but are feeling drained or feeling tired. Talk to people about it. Let them know, and you'll be surprised the type of feedback you'll get. And I think there's comfort in knowing that you're not alone and that this is a tough field that we're in, especially now. There's a lot of criticism from many angles about educators in our profession. People are questioning, like the value of educators and what we do. And we put a lot of work in, this work that we do is very similar to those of the first responders. It's similar. It's not the same. I would never say that, but we're there, like, for a lot of our families and students, we're the consistency in their life. We're that lifeline, they rely upon us. And, when no one else is there, they rely on the school and their teachers to be that support system that they can count on if they don't have it in their communities, in their home environments. So for us, we put a lot in, but I think, just being able to pause, reflect, and understand where we are will help, because then in turn it trickles down to the students. When we feel good about ourselves and we're locked in and we're centered, that work and that energy comes off and everyone else can feel it.
Yeah, no, I really like how you broke each of those B's down and discussed how it's worked for you and a little bit about your story and, taking on all those responsibilities, but realizing, you had to take a break, you had to step back. And, at some point, it does happen to everybody where they see, there comes a breaking point, I think. And, I resonate with you and, the mindfulness as well. And, meditation practice. And, I do that Calm app every morning. I have gone to a lot of meditation retreats, which, there's not really any of them going on right now. And I kind of miss that, but, taking a weekend and having that time where you're not connected and you're just with, a group of people and taking those mindful walks or taking, doing those meditation sits it's so refreshing to, face the work week again after a weekend like that. So, I hope that in the next, 6 months, maybe those will be back. And, you also talked a lot about ACEs, and I know many educators have learned a lot about trauma-informed practices in the past couple of years, but I thought that was interesting how you mentioned how emotional maturity makes a kid respond at an age where the trauma happened. And this also happens for adults as well. And I've read articles on that, And can you go a little bit more in depth of, how we might, handle a situation where maybe we have, for example, a middle schooler, who's starting to act like, a four-year-old because of a trauma, or maybe a colleague. And, we really don't know, a lot of us, we get this trauma-informed practice training, but when we see those behaviors, we really don't know,
Right.
what's leading it. So just from your experience, how do you approach these situations where you
Sure.
see somebody?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about knowing your students,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's something that we ask all educators. First and foremost, know your students. Are you building the rapport and the connections with your students and your families, right? Not to the point where they feel as though you're intruding on their personal lives, but really getting to know them, because once you do that, things make more sense. And then for us, we don't personalize them. So I think it was something that I learned early on in my career, because I started in my career as a paraprofessional in a therapeutic day school for special education students that were at the high school level. And, you really learned to have thick skin in terms of understanding first and foremost their children. Right. So regardless if they're 5 or if they're 18 and they're 6 feet tall, right, whatever, and they look like an adult, they're still, a child in a school.
Yeah.
And that oftentimes they don't, at the end of the day, there are things that have gone on in their life that is not your fault.
Yeah.
But like, how do you address them? So one is like really getting to know those students like beforehand. Once you're in the moment, right, understanding who are the external resources you have, right? I always say every school have a crisis team.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't have to call it a crisis team, but they have to know who are the go-to people and who have the ability to do that. So first and foremost, you should always have members have, some trauma-informed practice training, but also those that have training in terms of de-escalation, not physical management, but understanding how to de-escalate and work with children so that things do not begin to escalate and get out of control. Second, knowing who are those go-to people. So psychologist, counselor, school social worker, right? But not, I will repeat, I will be very clear about this. Do not call the disciplinarian, because when we're talking about, social emotional issues and challenges, it's not about discipline. It's not about, intentional behavior. We're talking about students who have challenges that are manifested, but it's not, an external, what I would say, it's not a situation in which they are necessarily defiant, and oppositional just for the sake of doing it. There's something else behind it. So I think, one, being able to talk to students, us, once again, why it's important for us as the adults and educators to be mindful and to be grounded, because we don't want to also engage where our responses could then, trigger a child to get even more upset. So I think that being aware of that, and you'll be surprised just talking calmly and allowing that student to kind of, calm down their own is good. The other part is, there's some techniques like looking up, when a child or you have someone look up towards the ceiling, right, it actually calms them down. And that has, there's a lot of studies with that, and it's shown that does help. Another one is having a child drink water. Actually drinking water does also calm a child down and make them, feel a lot more relaxed as well. The other part is understanding the difference between male and female students. I can talk about this for a long time, but just understanding the response and how it's different, right? So for example, if you have, a male student who is upset or angry, or two male students that maybe got into an argument or fight, you have to understand that for males, right, they need time to calm down. They need time to de-escalate on their own. So don't ask them a lot of questions right away. Don't try to push. You have to give them their space. Once you give them their space, they're a lot better. You try to push and try to get to the point, it's not going to work. So that's the typical male student. Also, in terms of males, right, their communication style is different. You know, a lot of males, if they have something in their hands, like a manipulative, they'll communicate, they'll calm down,
Mm-hmm.
right? Also, you know, sometimes we ask a lot of male students to look us in the eye, right, when we want to talk.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, males communicate, this is boys all the way to men, they communicate better when they're side to side.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So if it's just an observational fact, you know, just for any of your listeners to think about that, think about the male students you've had in your classroom that you've worked with, and think about when you see them interacting and how they interact well. Think about times in which, you know, maybe they were upset and how they responded and when they responded. You know, you can probably point out a profile of a student that you've had and what's worked and hasn't worked. And typically those things work. And that's just understanding, once again, our students and understanding ourselves so we can be self-aware and socially aware to help those students when they have a crisis like that.
Yeah, you have so many good tips on, you know, what to do in handling these situations. I've read about the drinking water, you know, and that's something I think is a go-to for many educators, but looking up, that's something new for me, you know, just having them kind of look at the ceiling. And, you know, I think, as you say, it's based on the relationship. It's based on what we know about the student already from working with them or working with the family in the past. But, you know, definitely having the MTSS support team in place, having, you know, an intervention flow chart, as you will, right, in buildings is always, I would say, mandatory in all buildings, just to know where to send a child who's in that crisis state. And you know, so often these kids are their behaviors are mislabeled and they are sent to a disciplinarian. And you know, as an administrator, I've often felt like some of the situations I've handled have been more of a counselor's side, right? You know, you don't want to punish their behaviors because you realize, and then you're walking them to the counselor and you're participating in those conversations that are those often because of something that has happened, or, you know, a trauma event that's now resurfacing. So I think this is so important to keep in mind, just these tips that you've given, and just how we're facing our students. And, you know, this also can be shown a lot of the time when we meet the parents, either through a parent-teacher conference or any of these Zoom or Google Meet chats that we're now doing with the parents, because a lot of the time we see, you know, the behaviors that are displayed by the parents to the student that maybe are manifesting in how the student isn't behaving in class. So those can also be cues, I think. And one of the other things that you mentioned earlier I thought was really interesting is how we need to recognize both the affluent students and the lower socioeconomic status students' kids' struggles. You know, it's across the board right now because, for example, I work in a more affluent district, and there are a lot of students who are very pressured, I think, to get into a college, or pressure to excel well in sports. And, you know, that's something that, you know, I think in the affluent areas, you have a lot more suicides, right? And it's something, when I talked to Frank DeAngelis for my episode, I think it was episode number 11, you know, he lives in this area in Colorado, and, you know, Littleton, where the Columbine shooting took place. You know, that's an affluent area. There's been a lot of school shootings in the Denver area in more affluent areas, right? And, you know, what is your take on the fact that a lot of these kids in the affluent areas are, you know, I would say maybe people just aren't aware of kind of what's going on underneath the surface with them.
Right. Well, I like what you, in the way that you describe that as kind of what's going on underneath the surface, right? So, you know, oftentimes in affluent areas, there are internal behaviors, right, that are going on, right? So anxiety, depression, things such as suicidal ideation, right, that are not always manifested, externally right away that we would see in terms of students that may have challenges or needs in other communities, mm-hmm. right? The other part of it is that, typically in affluent communities, families have resources, mm-hmm. So therefore a lot of times, students can get external support, mm-hmm. whether that is, temporary or more long-term, and they can still also get their educational, right, support as well at the same time. So they're not missing that educational component when they're somewhere getting support or in a program, et cetera. But what happens is that, a lot of times, there's so many pressures that are going on to be successful. And that's where a lot of the suicidal ideation comes under the suicide rates, because, once again, as we talked about, the developing brain, right? Anytime you ask a child to take on adult responsibilities too soon, right? You'll see stress, mm-hmm. right? You'll see angst, you see depression. So whether that's in an affluent community, because, parents may feel that they have to, that their children have to hit certain benchmarks mm-hmm. in their athletic, academic, or personal lives, at a certain time. And if they don't, they're deemed failures. So those are pressures that a child should never have to deal with. And then if you're in other areas where there's more challenging needs because resources aren't there, income levels aren't there, oftentimes children are asked to take on responsibilities such as taking care of younger siblings, mm-hmm. right? Or being the leader of the household because parents may not be around. Or they may be living in a situation where they're not with their nuclear family, but living with other family members, extended family members, where now there's more independence and they have to take on a lot more and be responsible for things that they necessarily shouldn't have to be responsible for. Mm-hmm. So it's basically two sides of the same coin, yeah. But oftentimes they're not seen that way. And that's where it comes down to, because when you're dealing with things such as seeing violence consistently, right? Yeah. At an early age, we know that there's higher rates of PTSD in communities where the violence is higher, right? Anytime a child is witnessing violent behavior, whether that means domestic violence in the home, whether that means that's seeing it outside of their home, right? Or seeing something to, extreme levels, whether it's death or gunshots, right? All of that is they're seeing that at a young age when their brain's still developing. Turn that to the other side, you look at affluent communities, right? All that pressure to be successful and to be perfect and to be better than, that's a lot for a child to take on. They're children. In both scenarios, they're children. They need to be children, right? And the pressure we put on them is far too much, and the expectations are far too high. So we have to let children be children, right? We can't put adulting on them at an early age, because it's not fair to them. It's not fair, and it's a recipe for disaster, and we're setting them up for failure. And I know that sometimes there are extreme situations where they may have to have a necessity, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So I think we have to begin to think about what we're expecting out of young people and allowing them to be children, allowing to develop and to have things to happen organically in terms of their development, because, children are always a lot more resilient than we think in terms of like when they develop and how they develop, and they develop at different stages. And if you usually give them an opportunity to do that, they are going to go beyond any expectations you could put on them, yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important to remember, right? And then, I think a lot of the time, like you're talking about, like working with middle schoolers sometimes even, if they're tall and, they look older, sometimes you forget, they're actually only 11
yes.
or 12, right?
Right.
And those high schoolers, right, that, they might be 17 or 18, but they are still, their brain's still developing. They're still young
yes.
adults, they're still children. And a lot of the time we forget, the expectations that we're putting on them. And I think, like you said, we just need to, make sure that whether the families from an affluent community or a community with low social economic status, we need to try to get supports for them and
Yes.
Make sure that they, that we're seeing any areas of concern and how we can support those kids. So we've talked a lot about just support in general of students and social emotional well-being. Out of everything we discussed on the podcast today, what's one thing in particular you'd like listeners to remember?
Well, I think first and foremost is that, especially during these times, make sure that you're taking care of yourself, right? Make sure that, taking some advice, if you want to listen to my 3Bs and take that advice, do that, but do whatever is necessary to make sure you send yourself, you're at peace, you're taking care of yourself, because, as much as we want to help others, if we don't take care of ourselves first and foremost, we can't take care of anybody else. Yeah. And we can't be the best self, our best self for others that rely on us. So if we don't do that, we're not going to have success. And at the end of the day, taking care of yourself, whether it's your physical health, social, emotional well-being, is not selfish, right? It's not selfish at all. It actually is being more selfless, so that you can be supportive for everyone else that's around you, and so that rely on you.
Yeah, no, that's great to remember. It's not selfless. Where can listeners find you online?
Sure, they can find me online. My social media home is Twitter, and you can find me at Evan Whitehead, all together, EVAN WHITEHEAD 00, at Evan Whitehead 00, and please give me a follow. I'll follow you back. If you have any questions, you can always, once we finally DM me. It's great. And also you can also contact me via email. And my email is evanwhitehead11@gmail.com. evanwhitehead11@gmail.com. And, in terms of anything else that I have coming up, I am currently in the works of writing the book on the 3Bs, balance, boundaries, and breaks. So hopefully that'll be coming out within the next year, and giving some more, detailed insights on my 3Bs and how to support educators' overall self-care and well-being.
Great. Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Dana. Peace and blessings.